I have a confession to make. I have shamefully neglected all my loved ones for years now, and therefore I have resolved to make 2025 the year of rereading. No, but really, I never used to be a huge rereader, but I have reread some of my favorites and I have reread some of them more than once. For instance, the original favorite, The Lord of the Rings. I have read The Lord of the Rings at least 3 times, and I've read The Silmarillion twice. I reread Memory, Sorrow and Thorn by Ted Williams at least once, and I loved it even more the second time around. This is a classic epic fantasy series, very much reminiscent of The Lord of the Rings, but with a decided touch of its own. This is the third book in the 4-volume trilogy, To Green Angel Tower Part 1. But anyhow, my first epic fantasy series after reading The Lord of the Rings, and I absolutely loved it. It was what got me into the fantasy genre, and it absolutely held up on a reread some, I don't know, 6-7 years later. And another series that I have read more than once in its entirety is, of course, Harry Potter. I've read the first 4 books 3 times, I think, and the last 3 books, I think, only twice. However, Half-Blood Prince is my favorite of the series. And the last series, Maggie Stiefvater's Raven Cycle. I read this for the first time shortly before The Raven King came out, the last book in the series. So that would have been 2016, and I almost immediately reread the whole 4 books the year after. And to be honest, I could already reread them again. They are just hands down the best YA series, the best YA book that I have ever read. And Maggie Stiefvater is just such a remarkable writer, such a remarkable stylist. And I'm quite sure that I will reread this in the near future. However, it is not on my priority list because that list has already 10 items on it, which I'm sure is much more than I will get to in the year 2025. So this is my rereading TBR for the year 2025 and beyond. The first book on this list might come as a surprise to you if you've watched a video I made called You Can't Read the Same Book Twice, in which I talked about a couple of books that I loved when I read them back in the long ago, 2 decades ago now, but I'm not sure if I would still like them. In fact, I thought I was quite sure that I would dislike them now. And one of the books in this video was none other than The Lord of the Rings. I was quite sure that I had outgrown the patience for it and for all its lengthy description of the most minor of details in this world of Middle-earth. However, I recently heard some people talk about this in a way that made me think that I would appreciate some of its aspects even more these days, namely what it has to say about nature, not just, I don't just mean the descriptions of nature and the environment, but also about humanity's relationship with nature and the destruction of our natural environment. I think some of this might be even closer to my heart now than it used to be 20 years ago, because I did read this for the last time 20 years ago, almost to the day, I think. But in the month since I made this decision to ultimately reread The Lord of the Rings, I have become really excited about this reread, and I even, because This is an omnibus edition, and I think it might break into pieces. The spine might just clean break if I open and close this too many times. And so I even bought the box set, this mass market paperback box set, and they look well, nicely pristine, but also much too pristine, and I can't wait to break them in. My second book is something completely different, and it is a bit of an experiment. It is The Catcher in the Rye. I read this as a teenager, a youngish teenager. I was maybe 14 when I first read this in translation, and it didn't speak to me at all. I know lots of people loathe this when they had to read it as young teenagers, but for me it was more like it didn't leave any impression whatsoever. It was completely nondescript, and I have no memory of the plot either. So I think lots of its finer nuances went over my head, but I think lots of it also had to do with the fact that I read it in translation, and lots of its nuances probably got lost in translation. And I am so curious to learn what this is actually really about, because even though I have read it, I have no real idea what it is about. Most of the other books that I have resolved to reread will be they will be fantasy and purely comfort reads. One of them is The Last Light of the Sun by Guy Gavriel Kay, my favorite Guy Gavriel Kay novel, and the first one that I read, tragically. This is about not England and not Wales in early medieval times suffering under the not Viking invasion. I loved the melancholy tone of this book, which the title, The Last Light of the Sun, also perfectly encapsulates, I think. I don't see this book talked about very much on YouTube, even in circles with people that adore Guy Gavriel Kay. So I don't know why that is. I think it is an overlooked gem of his, and I hope more Guy Gavriel Kay fans will pick it up in the future. I certainly will pick it up, maybe next year, maybe the year after. And then we have a handful of fantasy novellas, the first being The Green Hollow Duology by Emily Tesh, who recently made me very angry with her debut novel, Some Desperate Glory. I'm trying to wipe my memory clean of the fact that this book exists, because The Green Hollow Duology is really fantastic. The first book, Silver in the Wood, is a green man story written from the perspective of the green man, and it is enchanting in its forest setting, and it is also quite a fun romp. So in this story we meet our green man as he goes about his peaceful and quiet life in the forest until his age-old daily routine gets disrupted by a researcher with a rather hands-on philosophy who rather shamelessly inserts himself in the green man's life and also into parts of the forest where he doesn't necessarily belong and whose danger he underestimates. The sequel novella, Drowned Country, is also fun, but also actually heartbreaking, but in all the best ways. I'm not going to spoil anything, obviously, but I think the two novellas make a fantastic couple, or couplet rather. My next novella I already talked about in my last video. It is The Fairy Hounds of York by Arden Powell, historical fantasy about a young man who finds himself wandering the North York moors, or at least the North Yorkshire countryside, under a fairy curse, and he gets help from a capital T traveler who comes across him when he is coming close to being drawn into the fairy world, and the two of them try to break his curse together, and the traveler has reasons of his own, or beef of his own, with the fairies. It is a fantastic, wintry, frosty, atmospheric read, and I should really pick it up still this year, maybe actually, at the latest in January, February, we shall see. And my last novella, my last fantasy novella, or rather speculative novella, is kind of its complete opposite. It is set in a desert setting, a Sahara-like setting, or maybe it is actually our Sahara. It is The Sorcerer of the Wild Deeps. One of the first YouTube videos that I made was an in-depth review of The Sorcerer of the Wild Deeps, largely spoiler-free, I think. And the fact is, right about now, I couldn't talk for more than a minute about this book. I have forgotten so much about it. I mean, there are some aspects of it that remain in my memory very vividly, but I couldn't talk about them very eloquently right now, and that is a shame, and I really want to refresh my memory and love this book the way it deserves. And I also have a crime novel and a murder mystery on my list. Now, this book is one that I don't want to talk about too much because I actually forgot to include it in my winter recommendations videos. I had it on my list, but it completely slipped my mind because it's one of the ones that I only had in ebook format, but I have since bought a physical copy because I love it so much. It is my second favorite crime novel ever, maybe my favorite one. And the reason I'm not going to talk about it too much is because I'm actually going to film a dedicated recommendation video for just that one, because to make up for my mistake for not including it in my winter recommendations. It is Raven Black by Ann Cleeves. Just a fantastic combination of a breathtaking setting on Shetland in the winter in January, and an absolute brilliant murder mystery. I'm very much looking forward to traveling to Shetland again with this book. My next book is the only piece of German literature on this list. It is Faust by Goethe, the tragedy. So when I first read this in school, we read it in order to perform it on stage. And so we read it with a very specific kind of eye, with an eye on theatricality and suspense and the flow of the language, which is absolutely how you should read it. However, we also ignored whole passages, whole scenes of this play, which we just struck from our script immediately because we knew from the start that we weren't going to make this a 3-hour production. So we had to tighten the story and got rid of whole scenes in the process. And I would like to read this properly for the first time now. And the last item on my list is also a pure work of genius, albeit of a very different kind. And it is the most urgent item on this list, more urgent even than The Lord of the Rings. It is a book that, if you held a gun to my head and forced me to name my favorite book or the best book that I've ever read, I would probably name this book. And still, I have only ever read it once. And this is just an unacceptable situation. The book is, of course, the one after which I am named, my channel name and the name under which I go on I think, all social media platforms now. The book is, of course, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell. I loved this book to pieces when I first read it, something like 16 or 17 years ago now. It is the kind of 800-page book that in the end feels much too short, and that when it ends leaves you feeling lonely and bereft, because it was just such a treat to be in this book, in this story, and in its language. And this is, of course, historical fantasy or alternate history, more like, set in England in the early 1800s. And it is in England in which magic used to exist, and that is just a historical fact and not a myth, or not just mythology. And now there are these two wizards or magicians, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, who are going to bring magic back to England. However, their approaches are very different, because one of them is a theoretical magician and the other one is a practical magician. But while the two of them may be in conflict with each other, in fact, magic has its own idea about how it is going to come back to England, and that idea has in fact been long foretold in the prophecies. But if I'm going to keep calling this my favorite book of all time, with a gun held to my head, I really need to read this a second time. So here we go. This is part of my TBR for 2025 and beyond. But I definitely want to make rereading a priority in 2025. Tell me in the comments what books you have read more than once, or which of your favorites you would like to reread. I'll see you again soon, guys. Bye.